This is me talking to myself in the future and saying, don't start writing that comic script until you watch this video. Just don't. Creating comics is much more involved than you might first think. You're not just a writer or a creator, you're a business owner, a creative team leader, a promoter, a talent scout, and more. In upcoming videos, I'll be covering off some key things to consider with those other roles, but for now, let's take a look at what I wish I'd known before I started writing my first comic script. Unlike writing a novel, in the world of comics, words have a different kind of physical presence on the page, which means that you need to be very judicious in how you use them. Too many words will get in the way of the artwork, and you'll start to lose readers. And also, you're paying a lot of money for that artwork, so you want to showcase it as much as possible. I know the temptation as a writer is to prioritize words and ideas above everything else.
O sparrow, why dost thou feet pitter-patter upon the earth such?
But you're part of a creative team when you're writing a comic, and words are just one part of the overall project scope. Everything you do as a comic creator should be in service to that larger project rather than individual components such as writing. And that's hard to say as a writer because words are important and such. If you want the words to be the big show, then consider writing a novel rather than a comic. Lettering is far more than just putting dialogue in speech bubbles. There are rules to how this is done, and ignoring those rules will mean that your comic will be jarring to some readers. Lettering is just one of those things most readers don't really notice unless it's done wrong. If the sizing is off or the wording is oddly placed, readers will feel that even if they can't pinpoint exactly what's wrong, something is definitely wrong. Now, I'll be covering lettering in more detail in another video, but it's worth saying that there is a lot to be aware of. So it's worth doing some research if you intend to do this yourself, or it's worth hiring a professional letterer, at least for your first few comic issues. If you're lucky enough to be working with an artist who lives in your neighborhood, that's fantastic, but odds are you'll probably be working with someone who lives a little distance away from you, maybe even in a different country altogether, and perhaps a country which doesn't have English as its native language. In the latter case, you'll need to make sure that the artist can clearly interpret the script correctly. Avoid using local idioms like raining cats and dogs, blowing off steam, and so on, because they typically don't translate. You might also need to keep the language a little simpler in your script than you'd like for the sake of clarity. Instead of using the word diminutive, go for small, and so on. If you like to set your scripts out in a certain way and use certain words to indicate key points to your artist, that's great. Just make sure that you use these tools consistently throughout the script. If you indent your dialogue, make sure that you do it throughout the whole script. If you use VO to indicate voiceover or OS to indicate off-screen, then use that consistently and don't mix and match. Otherwise, you'll risk confusing the artist and burning through time and maybe even money in the process. Unlike other mediums, comic books have a real superpower when it comes to turning the page. This is your opportunity to shock and surprise your reader by adding a full page splash or some ingenious dramatic reveal. The reader has no idea what's coming, so using the power of the left page to keep readers engaged is key. This is tricky to do, however, when you're not sure at the script writing stage which page will be on the left and which will be on the right. It helps to have an idea up front of where the big moments are in your script and how many of those moments you want to take place on the left-hand page, i.e. as the first thing your reader will see when they turn over. This might seem super simple, but you really need to know the size and format of your comic before you start your script, or at least before you hand that over to an artist. Once the artwork starts coming through and you start laying out your pages, you really want to know with certainty that the dimensions you've got are correct. Ultimately, you're going to want to get your comic printed, and that means you'll need it to be the right size. You'll also need to make sure that dialogue and key artwork aren't too close to the edge of the page, as they may get trimmed during the printing process. So it's worth locking in these details early, and I would suggest talking to your printer beforehand to get their specifications. A full colour comic can cost twice as much or more as a black and white comic, both to produce and to print. Now, color is awesome. Really, color is awesome. But it's important to know beforehand how much a color comic is going to cost and whether you might be better looking at black and white as an alternative. So it's worth knowing a little bit about what kind of artwork you're looking at beforehand so you can be clear with the artist about what your end product should look like. Also, there are limits to color and there are limits to black and white. Knowing a little bit about those limits beforehand and discussing it with your artist is a great way to start. Coming from novel writing, my tendency early on in my comic creation journey was to try and stick way too many ideas in a single script. As a result, my first few comic issues tended to have more and more pages and get more and more expensive and less viable as time went on. As I began to develop as a creator and a writer, I learned how to limit the issue to a relatively contained story with a clear crisis point and some sort of cliffhanger or resolution at the end that has the reader wanting more. I also learned how to keep the pacing even throughout the story so that it's interesting for readers and you're not moving too fast or too slow. This all takes time and practice, but spending a little more time up front on editing your script will help. Think of it a little like a television pilot. You want to grab the reader's attention, throw them right into the story, and give them some meaty crisis which needs to be resolved, or at least partially resolved by the end of the issue. This isn't always an easy balance to achieve, but the better you can do at this, the better your comic will be. Adding more is not always best, particularly when it comes to a comic script, and particularly when it comes to your first comic. Having a clear idea of what the last few pages of your comic is going to look like will help a great deal when you start writing out your full script. You might not know exactly how the comic is going to end, but you should at least have a clear idea of where you want your protagonist to be at the end of the story. Being able to jump forward as you're writing to check again on how the book is going to end will help keep your writing sharp and curtail the likelihood of rambling or bringing too much into the story. Either way, you might have to make a decision partway through writing your script as to whether the content of that issue needs to spill over into another issue or whether you need to adjust your word count. Both of these have cost implications, so think clearly before you go to the artist. Now this one is incredibly important. Knowing how many issues your overall story arc has and how many pages are in each issue will tell you two very important things. First, how much time it's going to take to build out your comics. Secondly, how much money it's going to cost. I keep mentioning money throughout this video because it's really an important part of the indie comic process, and it's not something you can ignore. A comic isn't just something you can sit down and do on your own with no other costs other than your time, unless you're lucky enough to be an artist. Each issue will represent a substantial outlaying of funds, and whether you're just in this for the fun of it or you're wanting to actually make money out of selling comics, knowing your costs is vitally important. One key point to realize here is that the more issues your comic is going to have, the higher the risk is of three bad things happening. Number one, readers will lose interest in the story, particularly if it takes you a long time to build out the later issues. Number two, you might lose your artist and have to find another one, either because they're not available anymore, because life gets in the way, or throughout the process of developing your comic, their prices have gone up and it's no longer financially viable for you to stick with them. Number three, you run out of money, either because life kicks you in the teeth, or you lose an artist and have to pay more for a new artist, or your existing artist puts their prices up, or there's a global pandemic and postage goes through the roof. Again, the longer your story arc is, the more risk there is of costs blowing up and the project being put in jeopardy. If you can limit yourself to a short story arc, maybe 2 or 3 issues, you'll have a much better chance of keeping costs down and getting your comic out there into the world in one piece. Another point here is that indie publishers are much more attracted to short story arcs than sprawling epics with 20 or so issues. The fact is, dealing with creators is a risk that publishers take on, and part of that risk is the possibility that the project might fail for one reason or another, and the publisher ends up with the raw end of the deal and a book that can't be sold. Keeping your series short means that the chances of successfully completing it are higher, which means there's more likelihood that a publisher will pick it up. So that's it for this video. A few things I wish I knew before I started writing my first comic script. Hopefully it's been helpful. Like and subscribe to the channel and you'll get access to all my new videos as they drop. And also check out the Very Occasional podcast where I interview creative types from all walks of life. And as always, keep it real, keep it safe.